So I want to start with a classic of anthropology, a strange classic that all first-year students in my day were made to study. We first did an essay on incest, and then we did an essay on the Mafia. It was shock tactics. We'll do incest tomorrow, or day after tomorrow. Today we're going to do the Mafia. In a classic study, Ernest Bloch, studying the Mafia in its home ground in Sicily and southern Italy, understands them in terms of the gap that was opened up at the end of a feudal society. As all the great lords went to live in Naples and the court of the two Sicilies, they left their day-to-day actions in the remit of men of affairs, and men of affairs passed those actions down into families, and families which were mutual support societies that somehow existed in the gap that was left by authorities, became, if you like, the power in the land. They would talk up to the leader, to the absentee landlord, and down to the people. They would organise themselves into clans, into groups. They might fight turf wars, but fundamentally, the Mafia was how states that didn't exist, that had retreated from what they might have, where they should technically be, managed that absence. The aristocrats then managed their estates using the Mafia. So what does that have to do with today? Well, obviously you can see it in terms of anywhere where the state isn't, where the state somehow doesn't quite function. For instance, drug barons become Mafia, always become linked to the Mafia, just because the Mafia grow when you haven't got law and order. Then one of the natural responses, we organise on a clan base and a violent base and on local affinities. It's actually true where I live, here down in the deep root of France, down in the Occitan, in the Pyrenees. The state has never quite civilised this country. After all, it's a state that liberated itself from the Nazis in the Second World War and had cost an awful lot of lives to do it. And it is still governed, arguably, by families who run the mairies, run the farms, decide who gets which land and why, and what subventions are applied to it, what support, I mean. There is an element of the Mafia that is quite shallow where I live. But that's all fine. But what's that to do with you in your cities? What's that to do with you across the world? Well, I don't know about you. I am 56. And actually, for almost all my life, arguably since the oil crisis in the mid-70s, but really in Britain, particularly since the Heath government in 1970, there has been a slow pulling back, gathering a pace of what a state feels it is its duty to do. The social provisions that were laid in then, after the Second World War, that created 3 decades of growth like nothing else has ever been known, that seemed to solve capitalism, the great Keynesian machine that allowed you to use experts to define how the economy worked. All of that was simply abandoned. All the provision that it was somehow the state's responsibility to house its people, care for their health, look after their welfare. Bit by slow, agonising bit, it has been stripped out. Now, there was a brief attempt under the Tony Blair government, in Britain at least, to replace that by law and by guaranteeing rights. But even that, under Cameron, was by and large ignored, and now is totally ignored. The state, then, has retreated from where you could argue its historic destiny put it. What fills the gap? More than that, those states that haven't done that, here in France actually resisted, to a degree, that call for austerity, that demand the state reduces its power. The state in France was newer. It knew the dangers of it perhaps better. And with what result? France is now kicked about in the financial markets as if it was a football, and knowledgeable people will write about the death of France. You wait and see. My argument is always, if capitalism can't afford France, it's not France that's wrong, it's capitalism. Because France understood that if you actually want to have a functioning state, you have to stop the abscesses, the crevices, the abysses opening up between the state and its people. Well, it did for a while. So what has filled this gap? The gap that is opened up as the state has pulled back, as it has become more distant. Well, obviously, what initially happened was mafia-like privatised organisations. I mean, you, Baleful and Beastly. I mean, people who won contracts to fulfil jobs, contracts that were always on the know, with always a slight suspicion of corruption. What then replaced from the state side? Social provision, but housing associations that were held together by bribery a bit and by who you knew, and not really very clear financial rules. What replaced the state then but the beginning of the mafia? And the problem is, once the mafia starts going, everything else starts to really hollow out. And all sorts of other problems open up. So once the state pulls back from healthcare provision, then you actually start to get the destruction of the belief in experts. Let me explain, because that's a little bit more difficult. Once doctors no longer actually have the money to give proper healthcare, I mean supportive healthcare, then what they can do becomes very severely limited. It becomes limited to giving drugs. Who they're appealing to changes, because they don't have the money to look after their patients, not really. And so all their expertise is as nothing. They become people who have to talk about the finance and worry about it, and ultimately probably appeal to their practice managers and to the drug companies that are supporting their practice managers. I'm not going too hard on the drug companies here, because that's another issue. My point is that their expertise doesn't save them from a suspicion that the state is now viewed under. The state that, after all, employed its own mafia to organise those things it used to organise. Experts then, defunded, become unable to be true experts and become yet another thing people suspect, mistrust, don't like. And so you get a devaluation, or rather a mafiaization, is that a word, of knowledge, where people always ask, who's sponsoring you, but never actually ask the question they need to ask, who's sponsoring the gurus that they like. Because in these mafia organisations, sponsoring implies corruption, and will you join your own family? And yet, as the state breaks and pulls back, as it moves away from the people, as the abyss opens up, what is filling it now is not so much mafia, although there are mafia, as conspiracies. I have given up trying to pretend that I am not a conspiracy theorist in a sense. Oh, I believe in truth, and I believe in knowledge, and I believe in science, and the rest. But I also do think that rich men are destroying our planet for short-term gain. I do believe that Amazon, and for that matter Murdoch, deliberately hide the effects of their policies. That is a conspiracy. It makes me join a certain tribe that actually allows me to organise my world, both in terms of what I do and also in terms of what I understand. And in a world where knowledge has become increasingly seen to be particularised, as the state has moved back from knowledge and is no longer seen as its purveyor, but rather its user, or rather its defunder, so that knowledge gets used by certain people at certain times, there is nothing else that you can do. You join your interest groups, you join your mafia, you join your conspiracy that understands your position in the world, that understands you and understands this abyss that once was filled, as the state has moved back from all that it was, all that it's promised, and left nothing in the gap. We live then increasingly in a state which, if not mafia, is conspiratorial. But then what the fudge did you expect would happen? Once the state didn't fulfill its tasks, what were people to do but listen to those voices that claimed to be their friends? Any anthropologist could have told you as much.